We should have never gone into that jungle. We knew better. I'm not a superstitious person, never have been. I've spent most of my career as a field biologist traveling to the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth, chasing down species that most people have never even heard of. So when I heard the stories of the J'ba FoFi, the so-called giant spiders of the Congo, I shrugged them off. Legends, folklore, every place has them, but nothing prepared me for what we found out there. I remember our first night, our guide, Thomas, he was the first to mention it. Casually, like it was no big deal. He told us about the spiders over dinner one night, the fire casting strange shadows on his face. Marie, the botanist on our team, she laughed it off, saying she had seen bigger tarantulas in her own backyard. I smiled, but there was something in Thomas's eyes that made me uneasy. He wasn't joking. He was serious. It wasn't until a few days into the expedition that we started noticing things, strange things. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched. The jungle was thick, oppressive, the kind of place where trees seemed to close in on you, blocking out the sky. The air was heavy with moisture, the sound of the jungle muffled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then we found the webs. They were huge, unnaturally so, strung between trees like some kind of perverse decoration. Thick, sticky strands, as strong as rope, crisscrossed our path, forcing us to cut our way through. At first, we thought they were abandoned, relics of some long-forgotten arachnid. But then we saw the prey, the half-mummified bodies of birds, small mammals, hell, even a monkey, all wrapped in that silvery cocoon. I remember the look that Marie had on her face when she saw them. The color drained from her cheeks. She was pale white. Her usual bravado was gone. "This isn't right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say something reassuring. I wanted to be brave in that moment, but the words caught in my throat, and I found myself speechless. I had no idea what we were dealing with. I mean, this couldn't be possible, right? Thomas tried to steer us away from that area, but something kept pulling us back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something darker. We kept going deeper, each step taking us further from the safety of our camp. The jungle grew quieter, an eerie silence. Then we found the nest. It was massive, a tangled mess of webbing and debris, hidden in a dark hollow beneath a massive tree. The stench was the first thing to hit us. I'll never forget it. Just rotting flesh mixed with something acrid and almost chemical. Flies buzzed around the entrance, thick in the air. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I stepped closer, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Then we saw it, or better yet, it saw us. The spider. It was enormous. Easily the size of a large dog, its body covered in dark, bristling hairs, its eyes, 8 of them glittering in the beam of my flashlight, reflecting light in a way that made my skin crawl. It didn't move at first, just sat there, watching us, as if daring us to come closer. Marie was the first to back away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. But I was frozen, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This thing wasn't supposed to exist. It was impossible. And yet there it was right in front of me. Then it moved. I barely had time to react before it lunged at us, moving faster than anything that size should be able to. Marie screamed and we bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches and vines tearing at our clothes. The jungle came alive around us, the ground shifting under our feet as we ran. As we tore through the dense foliage, the sounds of our pursuit grew louder. The skittering, a horrific, rhythmic clatter of legs against the underbrush, was closing in. But something was wrong. There were more of them. It wasn't just the one spider, it was an entire swarm. We burst into a small clearing, the jungle pressing in on all sides. The only way out was through a narrow gap between the trees. Thomas went first, then Marie. I was right behind her when she suddenly screamed, yanked backwards as something snagged her ankle. I turned just in time to see a web, nearly invisible in the dim light, snap taut, pulling her off her feet. She was hanging upside down, her eyes wide with terror as the spiders closed in. I reached out to grab her, but Thomas pulled me back. "We have to go," he shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. I hesitated, torn between saving her and the primal urge to flee. The spiders were on her in seconds, their legs moving with unnatural speed. They didn't kill her outright. No. Instead, they began wrapping her in their webbing, the sticky strands covering her in a cocoon of silk. Marie's screams cut off abruptly as the webbing covered her face, her body jerking in desperate spasms. I wanted to help her, but Thomas' grip on my arm was like iron, dragging me away. We ran, leaving her behind, her muffled cries echoing in my ears. The spiders didn't stop with her. They were still coming, faster now, driven by some insatiable hunger. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. We crashed through the jungle, the trees a blur of green and shadow, the ground rising and falling beneath us like a living thing. Finally, we reached the river, our camp just a short distance away, but the spiders were relentless. They were closing in, their shadows flickering on the edge of my vision. Thomas stumbled, falling to his knees. I turned to help him up, but it was too late. One of the spiders, larger than the others, pounced on him, its fangs sinking into his shoulder. Thomas let out a choked scream, his body convulsing as the venom took hold. I watched him, horrified, as the spider began to wrap him in its web, the strands pulling tighter and tighter until I could barely see him beneath the thick cocoon. I backed away, my mind reeling, knowing I was next. But then, something snapped inside of me. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was rage, but I couldn't run anymore. I grabbed the fallen branch, swinging it wildly as the spider turned its attention to me. The first blow glanced off its thick exoskeleton, but the second struck true. Smashing into one of its legs, the spider hissed, recoiling, but it wasn't enough to stop it. I kept swinging, each impact sending a shock up my arm, but the spider was relentless. It lunged. I felt a sharp pain in my side as its fangs grazed me. The world tilted, the ground rushing up to meet me. I hit the earth hard. The breath knocked out of me, my vision swimming with dark spots. The spider, looming over me, its eyes cold and unfeeling. I could hear the others closing in, their legs rustling through the leaves. I knew I was finished. But then, something changed. The spiders hesitated, their movements slowing, almost as if they were listening to something. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they began to retreat, melting back into the shadows of the jungle. I didn't wait to find out why. I staggered to my feet, clutching my side as I ran. The camp was just ahead. I stumbled into it, collapsing onto the ground. My vision blurred, the world spinning as darkness closed in. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the distant sound of spiders retreating, their skittering growing fainter until there was nothing but silence. I woke up hours, maybe days later, alone in the camp. My mouth was dry. It felt like I hadn't had water in an eternity, but the spiders were gone, leaving no trace behind. Thomas and Marie were gone too, taken by the jungle, consumed by the nightmare we had stumbled into. I left everything behind. My equipment, my notes, even the photos I had taken. None of it mattered anymore. I just wanted to get out, to leave the jungle and never look back. I made it to the nearest village later that day, half delirious from exhaustion and the venom that was still burned in my veins. I tried to tell the villagers what had happened, but they just nodded, their faces grim. They didn't need to hear my story. They already knew. The J'ba FoFi had been in the jungle long before we came, and they would be there long after we were gone. When I finally returned to civilization, I tried to forget, but the nightmares wouldn't let me. I can still hear Marie's screams, still see Thomas's face twisted in pain, and sometimes, late at night, I hear that skittering sound, faint but unmistakable, just outside my window. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. Whatever you do, don't go into the jungle.